or to the cloud. And just find my Chrome tab. Thank you. Usually Lene does this part, so I'm a little bit out of practice. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. On behalf of the Denver UX newbies, we've got a really great event for you tonight. We've got an ensemble cast, so not just one speaker, but 4 of them, plus me. We're going to talk about adjacent career paths for UX grads. We're going to have an open discussion about what it's like to work with UX designers, to be a UX designer, to transfer in and out of those positions, etc. So we've got an awesome crew here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a moment. But a couple of announcements before we get started. Of course, you know you're at a Denver UX Newbies event. Hopefully, you're in the right classroom. These are our organizers, Lene, Chelsea, and myself. We do have another event coming up in June, which is going to be great. It's about creating a job search plan with Nick Anderson, who is of General Assembly. He's a UX instructor. He's taught several years and several rounds of UX grads and helped them land industry careers. So I think it's going to be a really awesome event where he talks about a really structured way to not only plan how to get a job, but also measure your progress towards it. So definitely tune in for that. It's going to be awesome. That said, let me stop the sharing for a second and introduce our panel. So we're going to go around. Let's start with Bryan. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Bryan. Thanks for taking the time to come listen to us chat. I'm coming to you from Jersey City, New Jersey, just outside of New York. I currently work as a data scientist at Noom, sort of the psychology weight loss app program. Spent some time at Dashlane, H&M, Petco in data roles, and doing an MBA at NYU Stern on the side with an emphasis in product management and strategy. And I'm just a big fan of learning in general and kind of pivoting and switching and all that stuff. So it's going to be a fun conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Bryan. Carrie.
Sure. Hey, what's up, guys? My name's Carrie Meskel. I'm coming from San Diego here, and I'm actually a full stack software engineer. So I've been many places throughout the industry. I've worked at startups and larger companies, working at like small companies like Peach Jar to even bigger companies like ServiceNow, which I work at now. And I am actually a bootcamp grad myself. So this conversation will be great. I'll be able to contribute, I feel like, some ideas and some of that experience that I came from in my past. So yeah, just have a love for design too. I've worked in some roles with design, closely with designers at Mitchell International, and have been in the meetup community. So yeah, I'm glad to be here with you guys today.
Awesome. Thanks, Carrie. Bryan and Carrie did not mention this, but they also had the pleasure, I had the pleasure of working with them at former companies. Joe is the only one that I've not had the pleasure of working with yet. Joe, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Joe Gaines. I am a product person. Most recently was working as an associate product owner at Kin + Carta, which is a large international consultancy. I started working at Spire Digital, but Spire merged with Kin + Carta. So I started working with Spire, and when my contract was finished, I was a former contractor with Kin + Carta. But there I was working primarily on API integrations for one of our large media clients. Yeah, and I'm in Denver, if I didn't already mention that. I have a very zigzaggy background, which I can talk about later, but I actually spent most of my working adult life as a professional opera singer before I moved into tech several years ago. So I'm all kinds of nerd. Just like Bryan, I am absolutely obsessed with learning and with the challenge of learning. And that's a big part of why I went into product.
Awesome. I feel like that's a trend that I've noticed a lot lately, is people coming from music into tech. I don't know if it's just my circle, but actually we had somebody visiting from our Bellevue office just now who was a clarinet player for about a decade. Another colleague of mine that started at Cloud Elements the same day as me was a violinist and violin teacher for about a decade.
Musicians and theater people are pretty fierce, especially when it comes to pivoting. We can do almost anything.
Yeah, well, you have to be scrappy in that that industry, right?
Yeah, it never stops.
I love it. I love when people pivot into tech too, especially the design world, because I think our job at its core is really to focus on how to think about things differently and how to uncover unique problems and bring others' perspectives in. So obviously we do a ton of that through UX research and understanding what people's lives are. But I think like having a diverse design team and a diverse technical team in general is super powerful. Cool. So we've got some questions prepared. Some of you sent some in earlier when you RSVP'd. We're going to be going through those. We're going to spend about 40 minutes. So we'll say probably at like 5:50-ish, we'll end the main session. And then we're going to go out into little breakout sessions where once you've learned a little bit more about each of these different career paths or adjacent career paths, we're going to put each one of our panelists into a breakout room, and you can hop in there and have a little bit more one-on-one or one-on-five-ish conversation with them and get all your questions answered. But if you have questions you want to ask the panel, feel free to drop them in the chat. Lene and I will keep an eye on those and we'll work them in as we can. So let's start. This question is for everybody, but let's start with Bryan. Working as a data scientist, talk to us about what's the most energizing and also the most draining part of your job day to day.
Yeah, so I struggled thinking about this question, but I like the whole process of data science, going from business question to some sort of outcome that drives business value. I think I get super energized when I know I'm working on like a meaty, like a really important problem, working to quantify some sort of unknown, looking to sift through a bunch of data, but like I have an idea of what I'm looking for. I'm on the hunt for it, and I just need to extract it and kind of transform it into something that's palatable for like a non-technical audience. The times I get most drained are probably either like really administrative work that I don't enjoy doing, and that's few and far between, or when I know I'm working on a problem that's not super important to solve, or it's like somebody else's kind of like pet project. Also few and farther between, but kind of like where there's not a lot of juice left in the squeeze, so to speak, and we're kind of just going through the motions to get to an end outcome and then kind of move on to the next thing. But in general, I enjoy most of the components of my day-to-day work.
It's interesting you talked about having the problem defined and like having a target to drive towards or to uncover. How much of your job is doing that kind of work versus trying to identify, like, figure out what the problem is in the first place?
It's a bit of both, and it depends on sort of the function. So like in my career, I've spent time embedded within different departments or teams. So like right now at Noom, I'm embedded within our marketing department. At Dashlane, I spend time with product, monetization, CRM. And so there's like a large part of like the beginning aspect of like really trying to understand what people are looking to do, asking why, what outcomes are you looking to drive? Like in a perfect world, if you had whatever solution you're looking for, like what does that enable you to do? Like what is the context that the problem exists in? Like I treat it very much like the stakeholders I work with are like my internal customers, and I'm trying to figure out how their world works and kind of put the puzzle pieces together and like, okay, cool. Now that I understand how the process sits out, if we tweak this or if we look at this, then we can sort of like more scope an actual problem and then quantify like what a potential solution might deliver.
It's so interesting to hear you speak like that. I don't remember who this was, but you know who it was? It was Marty Kagan. He was talking about how if you observe a really high functioning product team, you probably have a lot of trouble figuring out whose job is which, like who's the engineer, who's the UX person, who's the product person, because they're all really obviously have very specialized skill. And obviously Bryan's learned a ton of stuff that I don't know how to do that's data science specific, but the way he's talking about his job sounds very, very similar to the way that I approach my work too.
Yeah, I sourced a lot of information from like UX design, customer experience, product thinking. I'm a big fan of the overlap between those and data science. So it's sort of the lens I look at things through.
Nice. Cool. Carrie, how about you? What gets you excited as a software engineer, and what's some things that you wish you didn't have to do?
Yeah, so probably the thing that excites me the most, like gets me most riled up, is challenging and interesting, problems, like new, like stimulating, difficult problems in the space, and also working with like new technologies. Because in the tech world, I mean, there's new technologies that come out all the time. You get to work on cutting edge stuff, and if you're a part of a development team that gets your hands on the new stuff, it's really exciting. Like you get to see all the new gadgets and new type of functionality that you get to put in products that people get in their hands with every day. So that's probably the thing that energizes me the most. In terms of maybe stuff that's draining the most, I mean, this is not like a unique drain. Probably a lot of people see it in their lives, but meetings, like having a lot of meetings is pretty draining. Actually, at a company that I worked at recently, a Peach Jar startup, we eventually had a meeting day. It was like Wednesday was our meeting day, where it was just front to back, was all meetings, and it worked out really well. And actually another engineer, a principal engineer at that company, ended up working remotely on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And he said that those were the most productive days that he worked, because he could just focus on all of his work and get it all done without having to have meetings. Because the task switching is the most draining thing. So like if you have to focus on a difficult problem and then move away from it and have to speak with people and do other types of meetings and then go back to your work, it can derail. So I'd say probably meetings.
Yeah. Speaking of meetings, let's talk to our product person. Joe, what do you love about product work and what's challenging?
What gets me out of bed every morning with product is what got me into product in the first place, which, just like Carrie was saying, is really interesting problems. And this, we can talk about this later too, but like I spent the first chunk of my education in tech being torn between product and UX, specifically UX research. And I'm such a people person that like, I want to know people's problems. I want to understand them. I want to deep dive into them. I want to make it better for them, right? Like that's really exciting for me. As far as what's draining, especially in the agency space where I was working most recently, it's sometimes running into internal blockers on the client side that just completely gum up the works on your side, to like in situations when you have no control over that. Like that can be just immensely frustrating, and it happens all the time, right? Like it's part of the definition of being a product manager, is having to figure out how to navigate all of that, how to respond to that, and how to not get like caught up in it in the wrong way, right? But still, there were times where like there were decisions being made sort of in the upper echelons of the business unit on the client side of our project that we had no influence over, and we had no visibility into either, because it was like super senior above like our senior most stakeholder. So that sort of like hitting an opaque wall and then having to navigate or like through and around that, it can be interesting. It can also be really draining too.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's what we rely on you product owners to do for us, is to break down those walls and those barriers. We're grateful. Bryan, we've got a question just for you. So when we hear a job title like, or two words, data and scientists, both of those terms sound incredibly intimidating, and they both sound like I need a PhD to get started. How true is that? How many like years of education do we need to actually get started and to get our first job as a data scientist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to go back one though. I forgot one other thing that really energizes me that's tangential to this question is I get really pumped when I get to help other people learn too. Whether it's like a more junior person or like a business person kind of learning to like hone their data skills a little bit better. It's really fun to have those kind of working sessions. But yeah, no, definitely don't need a PhD. I don't have a PhD. Maybe on the agenda at some point in my lifetime, but no time soon. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. So one, like in my world, there's like a lot of confusion between a data analyst and a data scientist. Depending on the company, they're all the same. There's some different titles. And some companies treat them at different levels. Some people think data analyst is like an entry level, and then you make your way up to a data scientist. I think it's a giant gray area, and it just depends on the company and the team. I don't think an advanced degree is needed. It certainly can help open doors and pass you through filters if you're just kind of like submitting resumes into sort of like those automated systems. Definitely gets used as a filtering mechanism. If you get, 1,000 resumes, you're like, all right, just give me the ones that have, grad degrees. Doesn't really matter in what. But I think it's super possible to do without it. So like most of the technical stuff that I've learned outside of like a little bit of methodology is all self-taught. So like I did a grad program in business analytics, but it was very Excel based, light SQL, light R, light Python. I sought those things out, and then on the side, I taught myself like 95% of what I know in terms of like technical ability. And the easiest, I spent a lot of time trying to consume books, consuming courses without really like doing the grudge work of like struggling through the errors and kind of like actually trying to get hands-on. And so the quickest thing that I always recommend to anybody that's interested is just get hands-on as soon as you possibly can. Bonus points if it's a data set that you're somewhat familiar with, or like within a world that you're familiar with, and then just kind of go from there, trying to like answer questions. Like, okay, cool. Like, I wonder this. How might I answer that? And then kind of teach yourself as you go. The thing that also doubles as is you start to build up an actual portfolio, and seeing is believing when it comes to kind of like opening up doors and proving that you know how to do what you say you know how to do. Like just because I have an advanced degree, I still have to take all the same technical tests that everybody else has to take. And at the end of the day, that's really what people are looking at. A, how well can you communicate? Can you speak in layman's terms? Do you understand what you're talking about? And then B, when the rubber meets the road, can you actually do what you say you know how to do? And all of those things can be done without formal education.
I don't want to put you on the spot. We can come back around to this if you don't have one handy. But when you talk about problems to solve or questions to be answered, I'm curious, like what are some examples of the kind of things you tackle?
Yeah, so my favorite project I've ever worked on. So I got married in 2020 at the beginning, just pre-COVID, like literally as COVID went nuts. And in 2019, we went and saw a wedding venue, and they were telling us the pricing breakdown and kind of like the timeline of events. And I'm like, well, how are you supposed to know how many people are going to RSVP yes to something before they RSVP yes to it, so that you could start to understand what kind of budget you're looking at? So I built a little app that would allow me to input some stuff, and under the hood, it was just running some stats and some simulations. And then it would give me sort of an idea of like, okay, cool. Like assuming 70% of people are going to say yes, and you invite 120 people, you're actually looking at anywhere from like 90 to 100, right? Or not, that doesn't make sense, but some range of people. And then given your budget and your inputs, you're actually looking at this total cost and what's your risk of actually going over budget, right? And that's all. I didn't need any outside data outside of just some assumptions and some creativity.
How did it turn out? Did you go over budget?
It didn't matter. I was interested in doing the project just for the project, but it definitely became a talking point in some of my interviews since then.
Nice. Cool. Carrie, we got one for you. So, I'm reading this question, and I guess I'll give you the opportunity to challenge the premise of it.
Yeah.
But how do I know that I would actually enjoy doing coding work like all day, every day, before actually like doing it and spending time on it?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, coding isn't something that, generally people do in, their primary schooling and education, something people aren't really used to, right? So it's definitely different. I would say, for anybody that's interested in getting into coding, to just maybe go online, see what kind of resources you can find. There's so many like tutorials and like other information just widely available on the internet that you can just jump right in and kind of get a taste for it, just in a short amount of time. And I'd say just start a little, like a passion project or some little type of project. Start very small with building blocks, and maybe have it take a week or so. And then if you finish the project, I'd say try to finish the project. If you finish the project and it feels like it was natural, or it feels like it wasn't very painful type of task, then it's something that probably you could enjoy, I'd say, Yeah.
is it what about the premise of that question that I asked you? Is it true that you're coding 8 hours a day as an engineer?
So okay, that's actually a great question in itself too. You're not actually coding 8 hours in a day. In fact, there's like some type of statistic that I heard before, and I don't know necessarily if it's true, but for an engineer, it's like you're only coding like 10 or 20% of the time. The other percent of the time, you're either debugging code, or you're like having meetings, or you're talking about infrastructure, talking about how you're going to build out the products and like technologies you're going to use. But really like only about like 10-20% of the time you're actually writing code. So
yeah, that's how I feel about design too. I was just talking to somebody about that today. I feel like most of my job is trying to get people to slow down a little bit and think about the questions they're asking, or if they're asking questions.
yeah.
And get also like the right people in the room to like have the discussion about the product that we're building, and if it makes sense, if we're, if we have risks that we need to address, etc. And like, I don't know, I could go a couple of weeks probably without pulling out like a design tool like Figma or XD or something like that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we forget how many stakeholders there are and how many, contingencies and different people we need to work with. So yeah, it's not all about code necessarily. Yeah.
Sure.
Just to add to that, whether it's coding or gardening or like learning how to do yoga, like the best way to know if you're gonna like enjoy doing it is just to do it and then kind of take inventory.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bryan is the best example of that. I feel like he dives into stuff like super quickly, no fear, and goes for it. And that's something that I know I struggle with. It's challenging. Like when I think I want to learn about something, I feel like I have to go to school or take a course or like read so many books. But yeah, I think the encouragement to just dive in that you guys have been highlighting for us is a good one. Joe, you've got a question in the chat, and it was the one that I was about to ask you. You talked a little bit about maybe going into UX, maybe going into PO. Can you talk about like how those things relate to each other, and also a little bit about if and how your experience as a product owner has prepared you for potentially shifting back into UX?
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. So as I said earlier, I mean, I have a tendency to fall in love with people's problems, like because I'm a people-oriented person. It's actually one of the reasons that I didn't go into engineering, is because I'm more people-oriented, and I know that sort of like can dance around like a stereotype of engineers or whatever as being antisocial or whatever. And that for all of you in the audience, it's not true. It's not true. But if you go into product, you are like guaranteed to be people-facing all day long, and that's basically what I wanted. So that's why I went into product. I felt like, I don't know, I've always been drawn to specific subspecialties in whatever I do, where I feel like I can make a real difference. When I was an opera singer, opera is like any other industry or discipline in the world. There are sort of like the broad categories, and then there are like super hyper specific subspecialties that go down below that. So I wasn't just an opera singer, I was a tenor. I wasn't just a tenor, I was a character tenor, which means just like in TV and movies, the faces of people that that you see, you've seen them in NCIS and whatever else 1,000 times. And you're like, I know that guy, I don't know his name. That was me, but for opera. I was like the doctor, the lawyer, the priest, the villain, the sidekick, the Uber driver. Those were all of my roles. And I loved it. And I also loved it because it was a corner of that discipline that didn't seem quite as sexy as maybe some other parts. And so it didn't necessarily get quite as much attention. And for me, like, that's always the stuff that draws me in. I'm like, what's over in that little dark corner over there? What is that? And the thought of like on the spectrum of things that one can do with UX, I'm a pretty visually oriented person. I imagine that if I really applied myself in a UX context, I'd be a pretty decent designer. I think I'd probably be a killer researcher, however, just because I am so people oriented. And that, like, tying into the question of why I went into product instead of UX. Again, working in the art form that I did, it's a very intersectional art form. It's, opera is the intersection of singing and acting and linguistics, multiple languages, and dealing with an orchestra and dealing with costume sets, lighting, designers, stage directors, pianists. Like it's just there's this huge multi-dimensional thing that affects everyone in the room, especially if you're a singer. There's a lot going on that you have to be mindful of, and in that I think you can never really get bored if you're really engaged with it. And like of all of the roles in tech, like product, I looked at product and I was like, oh man, okay, the intersection of design and business and technology, like that for me, it's like I live in Colorado. I'm here in part because I'm an avid hiker, moved here in part for the sunshine in the mountains. And there are so many mountains that you have to be able to climb in product, sometimes all at once, sometimes separately. And that's really what drew me into it is I was like, well, the UX research thing is something I could definitely do extremely well in and something I could fall in love with, but there are these other pieces too. What about them? I want to do them too. So that's the short answer.
You sound like Brian, wanting to hop around all the time, do different things, do everything. I want to pass this to Carrie and Brian, whoever wants to jump in, but Joe talked a little bit about his crossover with UX and his relationship with it. Talk a little bit about how you work with UX people day to day.
Sure. So in my current role, I don't do a ton, really not much of all, because I'm mainly focused on marketing. But at my last company, I tried to work as closely as I could with our UX research team. And what I found is like the most powerful insights we could get were the ones that blended like qual and quant together. So like I could dig into data all day long and I can give you the what, like here's how many users are doing this. This is the path people are taking, but there's not like a whole lot of like why behind that. And so like really working closely with like UX start to get better context to like what I'm seeing, what makes sense to go further into, how can we weave this together to tell a more powerful story. And actually my favorite project was looking at the analytics function as a whole and going like, all right, let's treat this as a research project and understand like what our stakeholders are looking to get out of it, what problems do they have, and how can we work to create a better solution. And that was kind of me taking the data hat off and putting more of a like researcher hat on, but generally blending qual and quant together to tell better stories is what I've experienced.
Yeah. And I'd say as far as my experience goes with working with UX and product, it really depends on the position that you're in. But like I had a position where I was the resource for the actual design team as a developer. So I was with them all the time, and we were actually informing the product, and I was putting my input into the design decisions that would go out for the rest of the company and shape that product. So that was every day I was in it. But in other positions for a lot of developers, they are just implementation. We just implement the product, and there's not, I wouldn't say as much interaction with the UX and product teams, but you definitely do see the UX and product teams interaction very frequently too. So like when a feature goes out, you're going to be having a conversation with them about how that should be implemented, and certain decisions that were made and how those go into the final product. So you're going through that day to day. You're going to be having that handoff. So
yeah, Carrie, that position you mentioned, that was pretty early in your development career, right?
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
How was that experience like starting out as a software engineer on the UX team? How do you think that's made you different, or has it, from other software engineers?
Yeah, I think it actually influenced me a lot in that I think I definitely have a penchant for design, and whenever I speak with designers, I feel like I have a little bit of a shared understanding about what they're going through and how they want to set examples for what the product should look like and what messages they're trying to convey with the product, and the decisions that I make in implementing it and how we can work together. So I think about that a lot. Yeah, oftentimes I think to myself like, man, I could be a designer. Like I could go back to being like that as a full time. So, this conversation that we're having about changing careers and stuff, I mean, it's we think about careers as being like you're in one career and that's kind of what you're in maybe for the rest of your career, but it doesn't even need to be like that. It can be fluid. So it's a good way to think about that too. But yeah, it's interesting. Even before working at Mitchell, I had some experience on the other side of it, working as a UI UX tester. So I'd be like testing stuff before I even got in as like my first job in the industry. So there's things like that too.
I didn't know about that. You also were in finance sales before that, right? You've hopped around quite a bit.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was in finance in the very beginning, and I just found finance to be a little bit boring. You know, it's the same thing, numbers and making margin off of certain sales and trying to get people certain rates, and yeah, it just wasn't that stimulating for me. So yeah, I ended up finding my way into tech eventually. Yeah.
Joe, I want to ask you a question. It's not necessarily product owner specific, but you worked at an agency, which is, we don't touch on this too much in our UX newbies talk, but agency life is totally different from in-house life. And even in-house is variations of startup to enterprise to who knows what. Jumping into the agency world, talk to us about what surprised you, what people should know before they sign up and accept the offer they get from some agency.
Yeah, it's definitely its own world, and it's definitely very distinct from what a lot of my colleagues in product do in internal product roles elsewhere. I mean, I was really drawn to it in part for the same reasons that I said I was drawn to product in general, right? Like, never get bored, right? Like, there are just so many different possibilities of things that you can work on. I think one thing to consider when you're going into the agency world, especially if you're starting in the agency world rather than being sort of in a senior position, chances are you're being hired specifically to work on a project or a set of projects. And that may be all you work on for the duration of your relationship with the agency. Now, that may be true if you're working, you know, in an internal role as well, but I would say that was one of the surprising things for me, is they really needed me resource focusing on API integrations for this one major media client of ours, which makes sense, right? Just in terms of how they sort of laid out the resources. They did sort of plug me into other projects as needed. So like I worked one fun project that I worked on was helping get a recently rebranded healthcare company and their new website over the finish line. And it was just me and a senior engineer working every day. And I asked like the director of product development, I was like, what do you need? What's the main pain point here? What do you need for me to do? She was like, get the tickets to done, get them across the Jira board to done every day. That's what I need for you to do. So, you know, that the opportunities for variety were there, but when that main project with the client for which they had hired me wrapped up, that wrapped up my relationship with the agency. And it, you know, it was all good. Like they loved me and they're still trying to find, and the feeling was mutual, and they're still trying to find stuff for me to do, other projects for me to do in their Denver office, their New York and Chicago offices, or maybe even internationally. But, you know, that's something to consider, is that like, especially at an entry or a mid-level, as whether you're, you know, product person as a team leader or as an individual contributor, your sort of your employment, you know, hinges really on that like one thing that you're doing, which, you know, in many cases is just not the case if you're an internal product person elsewhere. Like there will always be other things for you to do. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. If not, feel free to get in the chat, or you can hop in Joe's breakout room in a few minutes when we do those. I'll add to, from my agency experience, one thing that I should have been ready for it because I worked at TrendSource, and that was my job for years. But you're just constantly selling. You know, Joe's point about a relationship ending, like, your job is not only to deliver really high quality stuff really fast and get the Jira tickets across the line, as he said, but it's also to like find the next thing that you're gonna sell or that you're gonna do. And a lot of agencies have even business models where you bring in your own work, and if you don't bring in work, you know, that's it for you. You know, the stress level and the competition level at agencies can be really super intense, but it's also, to Joe's point, an incredible opportunity to learn. I think the 9 or 10 months that I spent at Blink is, you know, I grew 3 or 4 years worth if I would have been an in-house agency or in-house team. We've got one more question from the chat, and then I think we'll go into our breakout rooms. So this is just a general one. If anybody has thoughts on this, any tips for starter projects? If you're a recent UX bootcamp grad and want to get into marketing and advertising.
So the first thing that comes to mind, actually, there's two things come to mind. One would be potentially starting like a blog or a newsletter and like working through the process of like building up your list and improving your metrics there. And the second thing that comes to mind is potentially doing something around Facebook, trying to maybe find like small business or something that could kind of beef up its social presence and use that as like a gateway to learn about like Facebook for Business.
Yes. I'll add in something that I saw in there's a Facebook group for the podcast, How I Built This, which is a great podcast. I love it. It's just they interview entrepreneurs and talk about their whole journey. It's super interesting if you're into that stuff. But this guy posted on the Facebook group, hey, I just recently graduated from UX Bootcamp. If anybody wants a free analysis of their website, let me know. And there must have been 100 comments on this thing. Now, that guy's gonna have to do a lot of work to do heuristic analysis of all these websites and all these apps, et cetera. But like, if you have the capacity and the time, and you know, not all of us do, to actually do a freelance project like that, go find some small businesses that like really need it. And who knows, maybe they'll grow up and they'll actually be able to hire you, or maybe they'll just get some buzz. Who knows? All right, well, I think that's it for all of the planned questions and the chat questions. What we're gonna do now is each of the panel members have agreed to stick around for a little while. So we're gonna do breakout rooms like we usually do at the end of our sessions, but we're gonna do them a little bit differently. So we're gonna actually have a room for each of the panelists. So if you think any one of these particular career paths might be right for you and you wanna ask more questions or hear more about them one-on-one or one-on-five, like we said before, you're more than welcome to. I'm gonna open